Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a few moments. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the eRenew webinar series on Europe and the world. I'm Carrie Ottoburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Barry Buzan, who will be discussing his new book, Making Global Society, A Study of Humankind Across Three Eras, which was published just last year by Cambridge University Press. Barry Buzan is Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics, where he was previously Montague Burton Professor. He is also Honorary Professor at Copenhagen, Jylland, and China Foreign Affairs Universities, a Senior Fellow at the London School of Economics Ideas, and a Fellow of the British Academy. His research focuses on the conceptual and regional aspects of international security, international history, and the evolution of the international system, international relations theory, international society, and the English school approach to international relations. He has authored, co-authored, and edited over 30 books and 170 chapters and articles, including Reimagining International Relations and the Making of Global International Relations. Also joining us today as expert discussant is Dr. Gustavo Müller. Gustavo is a senior researcher and research manager at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. His research interests include comparative regionalism and interregional relations, EU external action and security policies, Europe and Latin America relations, and legitimacy and legitimation of regional security governance and its organizations. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Barry Buzan of about approximately 25 minutes. Then we will turn to Gustavo to kick off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions, to which Barry will have an opportunity to respond. Then we will turn to questions from you, the audience. Feel free to send questions for the speakers at any point during the webinar by using the Q&A function, and you can find this function at the bottom of the Zoom window. I will collect your questions to share with the speakers during the audience Q&A following the presentations. Before we begin, just a few quick words on the eRenew project. The EU Research Education Network on Europe and the World, or eRenew as we call it, is a Erasmus Jean Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of eRenew, I would like to thank Barry, Gustavo, and all of you in the audience for joining us today. And it is my great pleasure to pass the floor over to Barry.
Great. Thank you very much, Carrie. A pleasure to be here. Well, how to describe this rather large book in a short period of time. One thing to say, I suppose, is that for me, this was a pandemic project. The pandemic was perfectly timed here. We're all kind of shut away, looking for ways to pass the time. And it just happened to find me at that point in my career where I had done most of the things that I had planned to do. So I had plenty of time to think, and it seemed to me that there was scope for summing up many of the threads and pulling together many of the threads of work that I'd been doing over the last 35 years or so. Now, how to conceptualize this book? Well, one way would be to say, what if the subject matter of international relations was how humankind organizes itself on a global scale, or on the biggest scale at whatever time we're looking at, and looking at that across history? What if that was how we defined the subject matter of the field of international relations? How would we do that? How would we think about that, and what would it look like? And that is, in a sense, what this book tries to do. It is based on English school thinking in some ways, but not entirely. So some people might think of it as being an extension or a revision to the English school. Some people might think it's kind of walked completely away from the English school and is just something else. I leave people to make up their own minds about that. But in order to think about this, one needs, in a sense, to expand one's understanding of what the international encompasses. So much of international relations is about interstate, because the discipline was formed at the time when states were already dominant. But you could think about a kind of interpolity domain, which was the political domain. We can also think about a transnational domain where there are all kinds of other collective actors, maybe economic actors, maybe societal actors, maybe uncivil actors of one sort or another, mafias, whatever. But there's a lot of other actors out there in command of significant resources and able to behave in ways that are international in a sense, although we call them transnational because of the state-centric bias. That's, again, fairly conventional, although it's not so conventional to push that idea very far back in time. And a third element you need for the international is what I call the interhuman, which is mainly about identity. There's a very thin sense in which we are all members of humankind, and most of us at least understand that in some small degree, although it's not very consequential for most people. But there are lots of other kinds of identities: cultural, civilizational, national identities, a whole host of gender and sexual identities and hobbyist identities, all kinds of things which don't constitute actors, but which constitute social resources that actors can and do use. So I'm looking at the international as if composed of three domains, and I'm looking at it deep back into history. I'm also going somewhat against the conventions of international relations, which tend to emphasize the military and political sectors of human activity as being the main composites of international relations, and giving equal space to the environmental and the economic and the societal domains as well. And again, pushing that all the way back. And this produces some very interesting things, because you find political economy actually goes back a very long way, right to the dawn of civilization. You can find some version of the basic deal between the holders of wealth and the holders of power as to how they run affairs, whether they're doing so within a state or within an empire or whatever. So there's a surprising amount of continuity to be found here. So 3 domains, 5 sectors. For the social structure, I use an English school framing. So I use the idea of the primary institutions of international society, which is to say not what I would call secondary institutions, things like the EU and the UN and the League of Nations and all that, but those kind of deeper, mostly but not always evolved things that become the norms and to some extent set the rules and the values by which the various entities in play govern themselves. So the classical English school set would include sovereignty and international law and diplomacy and war and a balance of power, great power management. But you can add to this other things as well. Nationalism, for example, strikes me as being very definitely an institution of international society. And it used to be that monarchy dynasticism occupied that place, right? So you can look to some extent at the way these institutions change. By looking across multiple sectors and multiple domains, you get a somewhat wider view of primary institutions than the English school would offer. So things like science, for example, come up, and sport, which it quite surprised me in putting this book together that those things emerged out of the logic of the analytical structure that I was using. And I also look at the kind of material conditions as well as the social conditions of humankind, and try and push that all the way back. What kind of sources of energy do we have? What kinds of materials do we have access to, and therefore what kinds of technologies can we produce, and what sort of planetary conditions are there. And so this was the kind of broad framing in which I'm trying to look at this idea of international relations as if the subject matter was humankind, and looking at how humankind organizes itself across history. Somewhat to my surprise, I found that this framework generated what to my mind seemed a remarkably clear periodization in which the social structures and the material conditions, and to some extent the planetary conditions, lined up and gave you pretty clear patterns. Now, to some extent, this, and the book is organized around this idea. So to some extent, this fitted with the conventional idea of eras and the conventional periodization around that in international relations, and more so in historical sociology, where the standard periodization divides up into the modern period, generally dated from the early 19th century, and then a kind of classical pre-modern period, which goes back quite a long way, back to the dawn of civilization, and then before that, a kind of hunter-gatherer period. So hunter-gatherers, agrarian, industrial, if you want to use a mode of production way. That's a very standard way of thinking about these things. Using the framing that I got here, I came up with a slightly different take on these. Not that that they change completely, but I think one of the more interesting things about the book, at least for me as the author of it, readers can make up their own minds as to whether there's anything interesting in it or not. But one of the interesting things for me was that it became a question as to, first of all, what defined these eras, and I looked for stable sets of material and social conditions and found them. But then, how did these eras transition one from another? And there I came up with a somewhat different view from the orthodox one, which is that these eras are separated by quite important and sometimes long transition periods. So, for example, the transition from hunter-gathering to agrarian civilization takes several thousand years, and it seems to be heavily contingent on global warming. So there's a big planetary factor there. Only when the climate starts to warm and then stabilize do human beings begin to settle, right? And they settle first. Right? Agriculture did not produce settlement. It was mainly the other way around. Agriculture reinforced settlement because it ties people to the land. But people settled initially in places where they could still be hunter-gatherers, but the resource base was rich enough to support them without them having to move. And as soon as settlement happens, the population starts to grow more quickly. If you are nomadic or mobile hunter-gatherers, you simply cannot continuously have children because you have to carry everything you own, right, when you move. And you cannot carry more than one child. You've got no carts, you've got no wheels, you've got no pack animals. You've got to carry it on your back and on your feet. So the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, the nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle, had a relatively low birth rate. Settled agrarian or settled lifestyles had a much higher birth rate, and those populations quickly grew to overwhelm the hunter-gatherers. So there was a long period of transition when settlement and agriculture produced an increasing human population, and eventually 3,000–4,000 years BC, you get enough population size to begin to get towns and cities and the beginning of civilization, agrarian civilization. And that then defines another era whose social and environmental and material characteristics are remarkably stable. There's a portfolio of energies available. You've got fire, you've got human muscle, you've got animal muscle, and you've got wind, mainly only for sailing, but nonetheless wind. And that's it. So from our point of view, this was a very energy poor society. And that restricted what kinds of materials it could have, and that combination restricted what kinds of technologies it could develop. So it wasn't an era that was famous for big technological breakthroughs. And its social and political orders were remarkably stable as well. It was essentially a social order based on inequality. So the political order was monarchical dynastic almost everywhere, with a small handful of exceptions. Slavery was almost universal everywhere, done differently, but in an energy scarce society. Slaves were one way of making up, as it were, for that deficiency. So slave markets were somewhat like contemporary markets in oil and gas and coal in relation to the society that they served. And although we tend to focus very much on the transatlantic slave market, because that was the recent one and the one that relates to the West, slavery is a tradition that goes all the way back in civilization, and you are very hard put to find any sort of civilization at any level that doesn't have it as an institution. This, it seems to me, is a situation that by and large remains the case up until the late 18th century. Monarchical dynasticism is still the main political framing. The energy and material resources are still much the same. One or two small exceptions like gunpowder, which change things a bit, but don't have kind of revolutionary implications for production or anything like that. You then find yourself in the early 19th century when what we like to call modernity takes off, industrialism and all of the social and political and economic upheavals and revolutions that go along with that. This, it seems to me, is another transition period, right? It's triggered by access to a vast but not inexhaustible source of energy, namely coal and then other hydrocarbons, which open up the technological and productive possibilities in a big way and change societies very fundamentally. The standard telling of this would leave you with the impression that it happened almost immediately, that it was a kind of jump from an agrarian to an industrial society. And in some material respects, that's nearly true. In other words, the material transition was quick. The social transition was not so quick. I mean, you had monarchies lingering on well into the 19th and even into the 20th centuries. And you had a lot of carryovers, religion, and sundry other things from the agrarian societies into the industrial ones. The argument I make in the book is more or less that we're still in that transition. It's not quite clear when modernity might begin, but certainly nothing has settled down into a stable pattern that one could think of as defining an era. I don't think that will happen, at least until we work out how to make industrialism compatible with the carrying capacity of the planet. And that's, in a sense, the interesting question before us as we sit here now. So that's the kind of big historical picture, which I have to say I found quite exciting to do, and I learned a lot from pulling this material together in that way. It seemed to me to the title, Making a Global Society, is in a sense about how all of those different eras and transitions built up. It's in one sense a teleological argument, but it's not teleological in the sense of saying this had to happen. It's a very contingent argument saying this did happen, and that's in a sense how we got here. I think there are some quite big theoretical implications in this argument. One is for the English school, which has to decide, I guess, whether it likes what I've done with primary institutions, which is, to my mind, the important analytical idea in the English school. Some people may think I've pushed this too far, and I'm happy to discuss that. I think it's very important to have brought the economic sector into the English school, which has been missing for a long time. And it's very productive to do so. And if I'm allowed a plug, there's another book coming along currently in press with Oxford, which looks at the market and international society and looking at in much more detail at how the economic sector in the form of the market or in the form of economic nationalism plays into the other institutions of international society. So this potentially reconstructs the English school as an approach to international political economy. It has, I think, the potential to bridge build across disciplinary areas, obviously between IPE and IR, where there's been a somewhat artificial separation for a long time. But I think this creates common ground, let me put it that way, between global and world historians and global and world historical sociologists and international relations. For people who want to think about international relations in this way and on this scale can now use this framing to bridge build to these other disciplines, which are already in a sense there, and offer them something to add to their own analysis of the big historical picture. So what else do I want to say? I think there are a few interesting odds and bits in here to be picked out. One of the things that occurred to me along the way is that this approach generates a theory of the state. There's plenty of theories of the state, but the one that pops up here is in terms of the primary institutions. That, in a sense, the polities in the agrarian era, if I can call it that, are basically defined by sovereignty as possessed by the sovereign, by territoriality, but of a rather flexible sort, in the sense that boundaries are waxing and waning all the time, and by monarchy dynasticism, which is the kind of legitimate political form which polities and particularly empires generally took during that period. When we start to look at the transition out of that agrarian era and into what we generally think of as modernity, but I'm thinking of as a transition, that changes in interesting ways. So the ownership of sovereignty stays, but the ownership of it shifts from the sovereigns to the people, right? And that makes quite a big difference, popular sovereignty, as to how that concept works and what kind of state it defines. The territoriality becomes much harder. The boundaries, for a whole variety of reasons, get firmed up and are not supposed to change as frequently as they did in an age of empires. And monarchy dynasticism gives way to nationalism, in the sense that the institution of nationalism occupies the same political space, but the combination of nationalism, territoriality, and sovereignty, if you take those three institutions as composing the dominant polity of the day, right, that modern set gives you the modern state. Whereas the older set tends to give you empires, and therefore there's a theory of the state, or more properly, a theory of polities in here. And I think that's probably worth developing. I'm not a theorist of the state, but that struck me as a novel way forward. The book ends up with a discussion of deep pluralism as the space we're in now, and and I'm continuing to work on that in other ways as well. There, the idea is that what is mainly discussed in current affairs and in some of the academic literature as a power transition between America and China. I don't buy that for a second. I mean, that's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. The power transition is to do with the transition from agrarian to modern and industrial. And in the first 150, nearly 200 years of that, the power of modernity was owned by a relatively small number of states and peoples, and they constructed a center-periphery global order on that basis. That order is now breaking down. The power transition is therefore about the spread of modernity and industrialism and all that goes with it, particularly the ability to extract wealth and power from the resources at your command. China is obviously a leading example of that, but not the only one. So we're looking at a general diffusion of wealth, power, and political and cultural authority in world affairs, which necessarily shrinks what has been the very dominant position of the West. I think I've probably said enough to be going on with. So over to you.
Thank you very much. This is a really fascinating overview of your book, and I think we have a lot to uncover during the Q&A. So I would like to remind the audience to please send your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the window. Now we'll turn over to Gustavo, our discussant, and without further ado, over to you, Gustavo.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Professor Buzan, for presenting the book, which it's a pleasure for me to discuss. It's, of course, an ambitious endeavor to identify, in many ways, the primary institutions, taking inspiration from the English school, and to, over time, track their development and the co-constitution with the agents, as you say, when it comes to structural agents debate, over three very, very large areas of mankind, and with a particular attention, which I think is one of the main contributions of the book, to those transition periods, right? And here, a particular interesting question is whether we are already experiencing the modernity, or whether we are still in that transition period that you highlight. I also find that the book finds that nice middle ground between, as you say, at some point in the book, a narration of people, leaders, generals, kings, presidents, which is kind of one of the streams of the discipline of history. Sometimes it's also about big events, big wars, treaties, the rise and fall of empires, and so on and so forth. This, of course, not what the book is doing. And at the same time, it's not doing that the sort of more abstract endeavor that many IR theories end up doing, right? Which is trying to locate that one factor that is supposed to be the engine of history, let's say power for realists, or in a way class struggle, or modes of production for a more Marxist view. So the book finds that nice middle ground, and ends up being that story of institutions, mostly the primary institutions, as you say, through different eras. And by doing that, I think it both makes use of the English school, which is one that I'm quite biased to agree with. I think the English school itself is a nice compromise in the IR scholarship overall, but it also, it contributes to the English school endeavors, theoretical endeavors overall, as you highlighted now in the presentation as well. This whole reconceptualization or conceptualization as well of the state as perhaps an institution, adding up to the early works of Edleybu and others as well. And it's also, the book is also, in my view, in line with your previous scholarship, in the sense that it's not only easy to read, but it clearly spells out right at the beginning the definitions, the criteria, the many other points that you make. What's a sector, what's an institution, what are domains and the areas. So it all comes together, and I think the puzzle it's very clearly laid out at the beginning, and always left to do at the book as you present is really to go then to see how that shed light into the empiric. So it's a very nice moment. Of course, it's big history, right? But you can see it's very much theoretically informed. And one last thing in this general appraisal, let's say, one thing that I particularly enjoyed and found insightful is precisely this coexistence of what you call the the three broad factors. So meaning the state of the planet or the planetary conditions and what the planet is capable to offer, in a sense, humankind. The material conditions of humankind, and I think energy here, you highlighted that multiple times in the presentation. It's one of the aspects, but the technology that allows us to also access that energy and make use of that and so on, so the human capacity. And finally, the third element of this broad factors, the social aspect, right? And here we can also go for the primary institutions as much as for the social glue, as you say in the book, or the secondary institutions, those that we design. So I very much tend to agree with the definition of the criteria, and the selection of primary institutions. The reader can find those immediately already in the introduction. My first question would be a rather specific one, in the sense that the only of those institutions that is presented, to my knowledge, as a duality is precisely one that will make a comeback later on in the book, is the market versus economic nationalism, right? Other institutions are presented on their own, but market and economic nationalism is presented as a duality, in a sense, it's an opposition, and then under that we have also multilateralism. So my first one would be a little bit to hear your thoughts on why presenting that as a duality and not simply, you know, using other terms like, let's say, mode of production or I don't know, capitalist, for instance, as well. My second question then would be more by using a policy hat, in a sense of what can be done to remedy some of our problems and that we have in global politics. And the book focuses, of course, quite substantially on primary institutions, using the English school approach in that sense, which then highlights sort of the propensity, as you say in the book, the propensity of humans to try to organize and stabilize agreements and solve common problems and so on, avoid war amongst many. But you also highlight that these primary institutions, contrary to the secondary ones, they evolve, right? The secondary ones, like the UN, like the EU, they're designed. Whereas the primary ones, they evolved over time. Of course, they're constituted with the agents, but they have a sort of they have some sort of resilience to them, right? Which brought me to think about to ask you, what does then what can that tell us about our ability to solve the common problems that we have today in global politics? Here I'm thinking, of course, those that you also touch upon in the book, like climate change, but also the fast changing technologies that could lead to, amongst other things, human replacement, the inequalities, the problems of demographics and migrations, right? If only the secondary institutions are to a large extent designed, how can we deal with the problems that we have today with the sort of long-lasting primary institutions? That would be my second question. My third question, and I would also like to leave some time for the audience as well, has to do with the non-Western perspectives and sort of how that weaves together with the English school, and how that is then presented in the book. Then, and of course, the book explore this global society transitions quite meticulously, right? And from, as you just presented now from hunter-gatherers, going through the agrarian societies, and now this transition to the modern era. And it emphasizes multiple times the significance of non-Western contributions on one hand and perspectives on the other, right? That's how I view these two elements, right? From one point of view, the contributions, let's say positive or negatives, those tend to be more empirical, right? And I think the book does a very good job in taking those into account, right? So this is the sort of the recognition of the agency of non-Western actors over time, right? Not only the great powers, but also in more the perspective of transnationalism and so on. So primary institutions as well as the secondary in the making of that global society. On the other hand, there's the taking into account of the non-Western perspectives, right? Which is trying to then integrate non-Western approaches, and then one of the key examples of that already in the introduction of the book is when you bring in the Chinese philosophical approach to the idea of dialectics, right? So you contrast rather ironically, as you pointed out, that dialectics can be approached with two different understandings. One is the Chinese philosophical tradition, and the other one is the Hegelian approach as well. So I think the book does also bring this non-Western perspective as much as it tries to bring also the contributions of non-Western actors. But I would like to hear more about the thought process behind it in terms of how is actually that done in practice? Now, I know that in your scholarship, you have collaborated with authors such as Amitav Acharya, and that's also a dear endeavor to him in exploring non-Western perspectives, and also how these norms and to a certain extent institutions come to coexist with local institutions. So my third question would be in this direction, right? What's the thought process? But what, in a way, what's the research process to make sure that these non-Western perspectives they are recognized in such an ambitious endeavor as your book? I do have other questions, but I will yield now to the audience and to the replies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. Barry, we'll turn directly back to you.
Okay. Right. Thank you for the questions. A lot to be going on with there. I think the one thing that I particularly want to focus on is the last point that Gustavo made about the West non-West perspective and how this book relates to that. I mean, as you rightly point out, I've done quite a lot of work on the West non-West, but I wasn't really focusing on that here so much as trying to rise above it, right? So the notion here, and for me at least, this worked. Whether it will work for anybody else, I don't know. But by focusing on material and social conditions and focusing on the primary institutions, I think I got the level of analysis up to a point that could rise above all of these differences, because if you look at the traditional civilizations of the agrarian era, there's a great deal that they have in common. They're nearly all dynastic monarchies of one kind or another. They all have slavery in one form or another. The basics of their energy and materials and technology are pretty much the same. There's a variety of interesting cultural differences, blah, 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 blah. But at the level that defines eras, there's a great deal of commonality. And so it seemed to me that what this approach had to offer to those who want a global IR is to rise above those divisions. Because I think there's some danger when you get into the kind of non-West way of thinking, that okay, there's quite a lot of fairly well justified anti-Western sentiment because the West has been dominant for so long and exploited its position. Let's not put anybody else there, right? Would sinocentrism be better or worse than West-centrism? Well, we could talk about that for a long time, but I'd rather not go down that route at all if there's a way of avoiding it. And it seemed to me that this particular way of looking at things did enable you to transcend that difference and find, in a sense, a truly global way of thinking about how humankind organizes itself over the longue durée. You're quite right to pick me up on this kind of strange duality of the market and economic nationalism. I'm not sure that where I get to in the book is any kind of happy or final resting place for this question, and you'll find it revisited in more depth and detail in the forthcoming book with Robert Faulkner. But the basic dilemma is when you start thinking about the market as a primary institution, you get this extraordinary up and down story, right? So much so that you could basically tell the economic story either way around. You could tell it as the story for the last 2 centuries. You could tell it as the story of the market with occasional deviations into economic nationalism, or you could tell it as the story of economic nationalism with occasional deviations into the market. In the long run, which one of those will look like the more appropriate thing to do, I think is still an open question. or maybe there is maybe this is a dialectical relationship. I think this is probably the best way to think about it, that the market and economic nationalism are in continuous interplay with each other, probably more in the Chinese style than in the Hegelian one, and that it's a matter of continuous negotiation as to what the balance is that best suits the political and social and material conditions of the time. There is also, of course, another dual one, which is human equality, inequality, which I feel equally uncomfortable with. And again, you could tell the story either way around on that. Although it does seem to me the agrarian era was pretty much deeply founded on assumptions of human inequality almost across the board. Maybe I should stop there. But thank you for the questions. Good.
Thank you very much. Now we can turn to some questions from the audience, and feel free to continue sending those in if something comes to mind. So we start off with one about fundamental or human rights, which the questioner contends is not a primary institution in the book, and he says that you note that this is due to the contested nature of fundamental rights such as democracy. However, when we analyze the development of a principle towards a norm and its transition to an institution, wouldn't environmental stewardship, which is a primary institution in the book, encompass similar contestations? How exactly would you reconcile this, and do you use human equality in a similar sense to fundamental rights? And if not, why do you consider environmental stewardship as an institution but not fundamental rights? And we have another one about we actually have a couple of questions about the carrying capacity of the Earth, the statement that you made earlier in the presentation about the transition to the next era. What is your definition or understanding of the carrying capacity of the Earth, and how does this apply to the current population based on socioeconomic conditions? And what do you think this means in terms of implications for future topology of the state and society in an era of climate change and this daunting challenge of global sustainability? What do you think the future holds here? And then finally, while we're on the topic of the future, which primary institutions that constitute the global social structure of this current transition period do you think will stick around? Which ones are the most sticky and will define the subsequent era? And how would these differ from those of the previous era? We'll start with those three.
Okay. Let me just take a quick note so that I don't forget what I want to say. Okay. Right. Let me start with the last one then. The primary institutions now, which of them are going to be sticky? It's a good question. I mean, part of that question is, will we have any kind of global international society at all, depending on how we deal with climate change and such like. But on the assumption that we do have something going forward, what the transition from the agrarian to the modern era would seem to suggest is that almost everything gets carried forward in one way or another. A few things might disappear, but many things will carry forward, but they might well change along the way. I mean, religion, for example, a remarkable survivor for a bunch of, to my mind at any rate, pardon if I'm offending anybody, but to my mind, a bunch of crazy ideas from the agrarian era that have no application to anything other than the agrarian era are fantastic survivors, right? This may just indicate the depth of my misunderstanding of it, but religion adapted to modernity and ran with it and has done extraordinarily well. Even monarchy dynasticism survived a little bit by changing itself into constitutional monarchy form. So its form survived, even though the reality of its power didn't. I think then, I mean, that kind of points me a bit towards the carrying capacity one and environmental stewardship and all of that. Carrying capacity of the Earth, that's not my expertise, but there's plenty of expertise out there in a readily available way. If you look up the group of people who call themselves Earth System Science or Earth System Scientists, they've spent the last several decades figuring out as carefully and as calculatedly as they can what the physical limits of the carrying capacity of the planet are. And this runs across a whole range. It's more than a dozen variables, which include temperature. It includes the acidity of the oceans. It includes the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle and a whole variety of other things, many of which are measurable, and many of which can be calculated to have nasty tipping points if you go beyond a certain point. And I think that's probably the best handle that we've got on planetary carrying capacity. And by their calculations, 2 or 3 of these are already getting quite dangerous. And in other words, close to a tipping point boundary. And some of these things are not easily reversible. They're not they work on smooth spectrums that if you go past a certain point, you get a phase change, and you can't go back from there at all easily or quickly, or possibly even at all. So these Earth system scientists are trying to tell us that the planet has finite carrying capacities in relation to the heat and the chemicals and all else that we dump into it. And unless we can bring our activities within that set of bounds, we're in trouble. Right? And I'm quite happy to go along with that. I think that's actually quite well worked out. The problem for the Earth system scientists is when they say, they kind of, as scientists do, they kind of put this forward as a common sense proposition. Here's the data, here's the consequences. What's not to like? We need to do this. They run into storms of social variables like how does this affect the inequality of development, or how does this affect racism and the way the consequences of climate change are distributed and who's responsible for it. In other words, the political and social contestations that surround all of these issues are well beyond the scope of what Earth system science can cope with, and they're kind of stuck at that at the moment. One of the other things I'm working on in the background with Matthias Albert and others is to try to think how international relations might constitute itself as something like a world system social science in order to provide a counterpoint to the more hard science stuff of Earth system science, because there has to be both sides of this, or the Earth system science stuff will just sit there as an unpleasant set of facts, but not as a viable and workable political program. On the human rights question, and indeed the democracy question as well, my feeling about that is quite simple in relation to why I don't think of these as primary institutions, is because neither of them is anywhere remotely close to being globally accepted. Right? Which is why, for me, if you read the book, you will find the bulk of the relevant discussion around that in the discussions of human equality and inequality. Right? That's where that set of issues is dealt with. It seems to me you can make a pretty good empirical case that environmental stewardship is now globally accepted. I mean, there are votes in the UN and other places that suggest, and at the Paris conference and elsewhere, that suggests that all the countries have accepted that they have an obligation here. Even if they're not doing it properly, they still accept it. Democracy and human rights were never anywhere close to that. And that's why I don't think of them as global institutions. Institutions of the West maybe, and some other places, but not global institutions.
Very much. We will end with 2 more questions to wrap up this discussion. We have one question as to what your thoughts might be about discussions on the concept of sovereignty nowadays and its potential future. While climate change and human rights are global issues which do not know borders, we are also unfortunately revisiting issues concerning self-determination, which raise key questions about territoriality. That's the first question. And the second one is, what does the book's main arguments tell us about Europe's role and position evolving within a global society characterized by deep pluralism? Specifically, how might Europe navigate its historical legacies and current challenges to contribute positively to the shaping of a future global order that values diversity, sustainability, and interconnectedness? Back over to you.
Okay. Interesting questions. Well, sovereignty, let's take sovereignty and territoriality together. They come as part of a package. It seems to me both of them, relating to that earlier question about what goes forward, both of these have very good chances of going forward. Territoriality seems extraordinarily deeply rooted and has been for thousands of years, and isn't going to go away. It seems that for, I don't know what reasons, I have no explanation for it, but somehow we like to organize ourselves politically in a territorial way. You can make a functional case for doing that because it's kind of easy, but it's in principle not the only way we could organize ourselves politically. So this, it seems to me, is going to go forward. It's very deeply embedded. If you look at the kind of day-to-day events of the world, it is continuously reinforced and reproduced. It's not showing any signs of weakening. So the question, to my mind, is not whether this is going to go away or not, but what might modify it and make people see it in a slightly different way. The best idea I have on that, which is far from being a great idea, is that in the interhuman domain, we need to work on strengthening the identity of humankind. Right? We've all got layered identities, and sovereignty and territoriality are part of what goes into that package. But we can also have a layer of humankind as a whole, and particularly of humankind as having a responsibility to survive, and therefore having a responsibility to allow future generations to happen. The environmental pressures building up might conceivably help push in that direction, so that one ended up with sovereignty and territoriality going on for certain kinds of purposes, but being modified by a more powerful sense of our collectivity as humankind. That sounds totally utopian, but we are all facing shared threats, climate change, pandemics, that kind of thing. That goes back to the carrying capacity of the planet. Now we can go on squabbling amongst ourselves as the ship sinks, but there's at least some hope that being on board a sinking ship will encourage everybody to get bailing rather than just let the thing sink while continuing to fight each other. The European position, I'm no expert on Europe, but it seems to me that deep pluralism is a very uncomfortable place for the European Union to find itself in. It's not the world that the EU wants to be in. The EU wants to be in a more liberal, globalized world order with global rules and people being nice to each other and blah, 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 blah. The EU is facing an incredibly difficult future in which it's got to, in a sense, turn itself into something like a great power, not necessarily by simply becoming the United States of Europe and becoming a kind of single sovereignty in that sense, because I don't think that's at all likely to happen. But it has to find a geopolitical sense of itself much more, and a geostrategic sense of itself much more than it has. And if it doesn't, it's going to be worse than irrelevant. It's going to become, as it were, part of what is fought over. And that's a position you do not want to be in any kind of world order, right? To be the spoils. So Europe has to get itself together in this regard, and to do so rather quickly if it's not to fall into that position. I think it can do that, and there are good signs that it might do that, and it would change what the EU means and how it works. It wouldn't have to mean that it became any kind of unified federal state, and that would be part of the interesting political experiment in the world that the EU represents. But it's not a happy world coming up in the next decade or two for the EU. It's probably its strong suit is going to be its leadership position, to the extent that it has one, on environmental stewardship and trying to deal with the climate crisis. So it still has scope there to be a rule maker and all of that kind of thing. But basically, yeah, if you were running the EU, this is not the world you'd want to be in, but it's the world you're in, and therefore has to be dealt with.
Very much. We'll have to leave on that rather cautionary note for the European Union. That is all the time that we have for today. I would like to once again thank our guests, Professor Barry Buzan and Dr. Gustavo Müller, and all of you who joined us in this webinar and sent your questions. It was a real pleasure to have you with us today. Before leaving you, I would like to invite you to our next webinars, which can all be found online at eu-renew.eu. Next week, we will bring in Ingrid Landau on human rights due diligence and labor governance. And then in April, Maya K. Davis-Cross on international cooperation against all odds, the ultra-social world. You can sign up for those at eu-renew.eu. Thank you very much again for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to have you here with us.
My pleasure to be here, and thank you for listening to me or hearing me out.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.